Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video, and today we are going to be looking at Epic History TV's American Presidents Part 1, where he just kind of goes through and does a real brief kind of a spiel on each of the American presidents, the first 43 men who have served, the 44 presidents, but only 43 people. And I'll explain that when we get to that part, but that won't be in today's video. But drop a like if you enjoy this and want to see more of it. Leave a comment when it's over. I would greatly appreciate both of those things. We're just going to dive in, and I'll just kind of offer my own feedback about each one of these presidents as he talks about it.
Before presidents. George Washington, hero of the Revolutionary War and America's first president. Twice elected unanimously by the Electoral College. He steered America on a course of neutrality and stepped down after 2 terms.
All right, so let's talk about Washington real quick, and I can see he's doing a ranking of each one. I don't know if these are his personal rankings or if he's drawing these from somewhere, but I don't have my own personal ranking, but I will kind of comment on whatever rankings he did. I would put Washington in that area near the top, certainly. Washington's not one of those guys that you can point to a specific thing like Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, FDR, World War II, things like that. But what was genius for Washington was that basically Washington inherited a position that was not defined. There's a few guidelines, there's a few things that are laid out in the Constitution, but for the most part, Washington had to come up with it all from scratch. When he took office, there was no term limits. In fact, those didn't come around until after FDR. He didn't really have any idea on how to put together a cabinet, things of that nature. He had to define his own kind of limits for executive power. Because those things weren't always real clear. So, yes, he did kind of chart neutrality for us because there was a lot of pressure for him to jump in during the French Revolution because the French had helped us out. And in his cabinet, there were these very, very strong polar opposites in the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who just could not stand each other and were the North and South pole of political thought at that time. Hamilton being for a very strong executive branch, and Jefferson being very much in favor of what they had under the Articles of Confederation, which was more of a weak central government that was holding together a confederation of strong states. Of course, Washington becomes then a Federalist, which is who Hamilton was.
John Adams, lawyer, diplomat, and intellectual. He'd been one of the leading voices in the call for American independence. He avoided all-out war with France, was the first president to live in the White House, and the first to lose an election.
So Adams moves into the White House right at the end of his term. It's very near to the end, and honestly, he probably would have preferred to have remained in Philadelphia because it was a little closer to home in Massachusetts. Now, Adams, as vice president, and then even to some extent as president, would go home for months at a time and wasn't even in the Capitol when he was serving as vice president and as president. And he just was not somebody who really, I think, enjoyed the job a whole lot. And Washington had basically said something to him as they were changing over power, and basically something to the effect of, I'm out and you're in. Let's see who's happier. And of course, Adams had been good friends with Thomas Jefferson, but they had a huge falling out when Jefferson defeats him. Jefferson was the vice president at the time. Back then, the runner-up for the Electoral College became the vice president. Of course, when it happened with Adams and Jefferson, Jefferson changed that, and they made a change so that wasn't the case anymore.
Thomas Jefferson, chief author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a fierce defender of individual liberty, though, like several early presidents, himself owned slaves. He opposed federalism and strong central government, but doubled America's size by buying 800,000 square miles of territory from France.
Which is something you could argue kind of goes right against all of that stuff about the strong central government, because he makes this huge purchase and doubles the size of our land. And there was no real clear idea on whether or not he even had the authority to do that. But he did, and he commissions Lewis and Clark to go explore it, which was great, and I think that's probably largely why he gets such high marks. He also, in another thing that seemed to kind of go against the idea of strong central authority, helps establish West Point as a military academy. His first vice president was Aaron Burr, who kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Burr almost beat Jefferson for the presidency. They actually tied in the Electoral College, and then it goes multiple ballots, dozens of ballots in the House before the House finally throws its support to Jefferson. Burr becomes vice president, but he already knows he's a lame duck vice president. He's not going to be when they make the change and they actually go to a system as we know it today with where you have a vice president and a running mate. He knew he was not going to be there, so he actually runs for governor of New York, and he loses that. And then it's the governor of New York, George Clinton, who replaces him as vice president for Jefferson's second term.
James Madison. At 5'4", America's shortest president, but a towering figure in the fight to pass the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. As president, he was forced to fight another war against Great Britain to uphold America's rights at sea.
So Madison, he's actually the last American president to actually personally lead troops in battle as commander-in-chief, which he did during the War of 1812 briefly. His wife, Dolly Madison, of course, famously rescues the portrait of George Washington from the White House before it's burned. Madison had been in Congress after the Constitution was adopted. He was the father of the Constitution, took a ton of notes during the debate over the Constitutional Convention, and was one of the people, along with Alexander Hamilton, who had written the Federalist Papers, but of course they end up on opposite political sides later on.
James Monroe, the last president who was also a founding father. He warned Europe not to meddle in American affairs, while promising the U.S. would not interfere in Europe's affairs. He passed legislation to restrict slavery to existing slave states and new territories south of the Missouri Compromise line.
So the whole idea between the time Washington becomes president all the way up to the Civil War, the overarching theme was balance between North and South, so that one side didn't get all the power and be able to kind of do what it wanted to. So there was this constant compromise to make sure that each side, slave and free states, had equal representation, at least in the Senate. So anytime they were going to try to add a new state to the Union, if it was going to be a free state or a slave state, they always had to try and find a way to balance that out. And so the Missouri Compromise is one of many of those compromises. And of course, they admit Missouri as a slave state, but then the idea is that after that, no new territories north of that Missouri Compromise line can enter as slave states. And I think they bring in Maine as a new free state to keep the balance.
He also supported the colonization of Liberia by free African Americans, which is why its capital, Monrovia, is named after him. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, America's second president. A brilliant diplomat who prioritized economic development while paying off most of America's national debt.
So John Quincy Adams, again, the first two presidents to not serve two terms are John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams. John Adams actually lives long enough to see his son become president, dies while his son is president in 1826. Funny, and a lot of people know this, I know, but John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who had been strong rivals, eventually become friends again. They write letters back and forth. They're brilliant letters. One of my favorite letters ever was the one that Jefferson writes to John Adams after his wife dies. And just some of the words, and I'm not a Thomas Jefferson fan. I don't like him very much at all, but I can't doubt him as a writer, and I love the words he used to try and console his friend. But they both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the adoption of it. Not everybody signed on July 4th. In fact, very few people did. But John Quincy serves one term as president, but then later on, goes back as a congressman, becomes a member of the House of Representatives after he had been president, which, could you imagine that today? That's just an amazing thing that he was willing to do that. He collapses and ends up dying while still serving as a member of the House.
Andrew Jackson, a no-nonsense soldier, hero of the War of 1812, and founder of the Democratic Party.
Huge racist, too.
Once wounded in a duel, his authoritarian style caused his opponents, the Whigs, to brand him a dictator.
Well,
he began a...
let's talk about this dictatorship thing. There's this case that concerning his battle with Native Americans that he was trying to relocate across the Mississippi River. And this Native American tribe actually wins a Supreme Court case against the government, against Andrew Jackson. And Jackson said, well, the Supreme Court made their ruling, now let's see them enforce it. And then he just completely ignored the Supreme Court ruling and did what he wanted to anyway. He's responsible, of course, for the Trail of Tears, which is a huge blight on our country. Terrible thing that happened.
A policy of forced relocation of Native American tribes to west of the Mississippi River. Martin Van Buren, the first president born in an independent United States.
Old
Son of an
Kinderhook,
innkeeper, he spoke Dutch at home. His presidency was dominated by America's first major financial crash. He served one term, then lost 3 subsequent bids for re-election. William Henry Harrison, a soldier who spent most of his career fighting Native Americans. He gave the longest inaugural speech in history,
which killed him,
but served the shortest time in office. 30 days after his speech, he died of pneumonia, the first president to die in office.
So William Henry Harrison is shared and claimed by both Virginia and Ohio. He's actually buried in Ohio. I've been to his grave. That was before I was making videos, or I would have recorded there while I was there. It's down near Cincinnati. And of course, his father, Benjamin Harrison, had signed the Declaration of Independence. His son, John Scott Harrison, is a congressman. His grandson, Benjamin Harrison, also becomes president. And William Henry Harrison, he was born in Virginia, but he actually gets elected to the office of president from Ohio. So that's why Ohio and Virginia each have 7 presidents of their own, and then one that they both claim. So, but Harrison, he gets ill at his inauguration speech, which he gives a really long one in the bad weather, gets ill, ends up dying a month later, and his vice president then takes over.
John Tyler, the first vice president to become president following the death of his predecessor, expelled from his own party, the Whigs, for vetoing their bills, which he believed to contravene states' rights.
All right, so John Tyler, let's talk about him because there's a couple interesting things about John Tyler. Number one, he was married twice. His had a ton of kids. I don't remember exactly how many, but it's well over a dozen kids. Multiple kids with his first wife, multiple kids with his second wife. His second wife, Julia Gardner Tyler, who's actually a distant cousin of my wife, and they have a common ancestor named Lyon Gardner, who was a settler of Long Island, and there's a Gardner's Island off the end of Long Island that's still owned by the family. But Julia Gardner Tyler was much younger than John, and so John Tyler is still having kids in his 60s. And interestingly enough, then, John Tyler's son had kids into his 60s and 70s. And going into 2020, 2 of John Tyler's grandsons were still living. One of them actually died this year. I think one of them was Harrison Tyler. The other one was Lyon Gardner Tyler. And one of them died. The other one's still alive as of December of 2020. So it's amazing. A guy born in the 1700s had 2 living grandsons. Still has 1 living grandson.
James K. Polk, a firm believer in westward expansion, he signed the law admitting Texas to the Union and provoked a war with Mexico, resulting in the acquisition of 500,000 square miles of North America, including California, Nevada, and Utah. He also negotiated the division of Oregon with the British.
Yeah, I'd rank him fairly high as a president. Probably the last good president we had until Lincoln. There was a series of bad presidents kind of in that span in the 1850s there. But Polk is a Nashville guy. He and Andrew Jackson are both buried in Nashville. Polk's actually buried on the grounds of the state capitol building in Nashville. Again, one-term president. A lot of one-term presidents happening here at this point.
Zachary Taylor, career soldier, hero of the Mexican War, had never voted before and held no firm political beliefs. With tensions rising between slave-owning and free states, he threatened to hang Southern secessionists, but died suddenly of a stomach illness.
So Zachary Taylor, they actually exhumed him a few years ago. If you do a little Googling, you can actually see a picture of his skull from the exhumation. He's buried in Louisville, Kentucky, in Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. I got to visit that one a few years back, too. Again, I wasn't making videos yet, or I would have. Taylor doesn't serve very long, dies in office, probably, I think it was cholera or something, some bad cherries and ice cream that he ate. But they exhumed him because there was a rumor that he may have been poisoned, but they confirmed he was not, in fact, poisoned. But great general of the Mexican War, very highly sought after. One of our first kind of guys that goes right from military hero right into the White House, kind of like Grant and Eisenhower later on.
Millard Fillmore, born in a log cabin, the last Whig president. He supported an uneasy compromise between free and slave states, which was to prove short-lived.
New York man. He's actually buried in Buffalo, New York, which is also where William McKinley was assassinated. But Fillmore not remembered for much. Just another guy who kicked the can down the road with the Compromise of 1850. Same thing with Pierce. Same thing with Buchanan. They all just kind of did nothing to solve this crisis that was coming.
Franklin Pierce.
Oh, sad story.
Took office shortly after he and his wife witnessed the violent death of their 11-year-old son. A trauma that likely left them both suffering from depression. He hastened the slide towards civil war by allowing brutal violence to engulf Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery settlers fought for control of the territory.
So Franklin Pierce, they're on the train, on their way for him to be inaugurated, and there's this train accident, and his only son is decapitated right in front of them in this train accident. Horrifying thing. Can't possibly imagine what that guy went through, and imagine that then you have to take office as president with that happening. He was a terrible alcoholic after that. I don't know if his alcoholism had preceded that event, but it certainly happened after that, and just accomplished very little as president, and just was a broken man, as any of us would have been with something like that. Everybody says, though, he was probably the most handsome president we've ever had. I'm not really attracted to guys, so I can't speak to that. But Bleeding Kansas, then, this is because they've gone back on the idea of the compromise line, and now they've decided to go with self-determination. Let's let any new territories vote and decide for themselves if they want to be free or slave state. And so all these abolitionists go to Kansas to try and push it into the free side. All these slaveholders and pro-slavery people go in to push it to their side, and it's kind of a mini Civil War. It's a preview of the American Civil War to come.
James Buchanan. His attempts to mediate between northern free states and southern slave states failed abjectly, leading the Democratic Party to split and the southern states to leave the Union.
So Buchanan, only single man, only person who never married who became president. Also the only president from Pennsylvania, which is kind of amazing considering it was one of the biggest and most influential states early in the Union. And again, didn't do anything to stop it. His vice president was John C. Breckinridge, who later becomes a Confederate general. His Secretary of War, John Floyd, becomes a Confederate general who was secretly sending arms and munitions and supplies from the north to the south in preparation for the war, so that they would have everything in the south if a war did break out.
Abraham Lincoln.
Nothing we need to say about him.
America's first Republican president.
Ranking him third.
He led the North to victory in the Civil War
Who are we putting ahead of him?
and freed all Southern slaves by executive order. He
Obviously,
was
he's
the
going
first
with
president to
FDR
be assassinated,
as one of the top two.
shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Andrew Johnson,
Worst.
a
Okay, I'll
Southerner
give him 43.
born into poverty.
Yeah.
He sided with the Union during the Civil War. But after the war, he blocked Congress's attempts to impose reforms on the South. This led to his impeachment, though he was acquitted in the Senate by 1 vote.
All right, so Andrew Johnson, the idea, Lincoln's first vice president had been Hannibal Hamlin, I think was from Maine. And so in 1864, he's running for re-election, and so they run on the Union ticket. So what does he do to try and push this idea of Union? He picks a Southern Democrat as his running mate. Johnson was the war governor of Tennessee. He was a Democrat and a pro-slavery Democrat, but one who stayed pro-Union. And so they put him on the ticket. Of course, nobody has any idea that just a month into the second term that Lincoln's going to be assassinated and Johnson's going to become president. And so you go from Lincoln, right on the verge of winning the Civil War and passing the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, to Johnson to run the post-war country, who's pro-slavery, pro-South, and just ruins all of the attempts to try and build equality for these newly freed slaves, and just stops everything that the radical Republicans are trying to do to make that happen. And in my personal opinion, probably one of the 2 or 3 worst things to happen in the entire history of our country would be Johnson becoming president, because that was such a crucial time in American history, especially for these newly freed slaves. And I think so much of what our country dealt with after the Civil War in terms of the racism and the suppression of the rights of African Americans in the South can be directly tied to Andrew Johnson becoming president. He was impeached for violating something called the Tenure of Office Act, which had been passed over his veto, specifically to provoke him into something they could impeach him for. And he fires a member of his cabinet, which he had inherited from Lincoln, and that's what they used to impeach him. But he's impeached, but he's acquitted, like they said, by 1 vote.
Ulysses S. Grant, Union hero of the Civil War.
It's a fair range.
He used the military to enforce Reconstruction of former slave states and protect those targeted by white supremacist violence in the South. His presidency also saw war against Native Americans in the Great Plains.
So Grant establishes the Department of Justice, which we still have today, as a way of dealing with the Klan and other elements in the South. Did all he could for them. Pushes for full equality for former slaves through the 14th, 15th Amendments, to give them citizenship, give them the right to vote. But what he ends up seeing is the longer his term goes on, the more public opinion shifts against Reconstruction, and he finds it harder and harder to be able to keep the troops there and do the things he needs to do. And he was also plagued by corruption within his own administration. Nothing he was directly tied to, but he trusted people more than he should have in his administration, and that kind of came back to bite him, unfortunately. And he actually did look at the idea after leaving for a term of trying to get the nomination back in the 1880 Republican nomination, but it ends up going to Garfield instead.
Rutherford B. Hayes won the most disputed, corrupt, and violent presidential election in U.S. history.
2000 had nothing on him.
He sought to heal the wounds left by the Civil War and Reconstruction, but by withdrawing federal troops from the South, allowed white supremacists to regain power.
Here's the thing about that. I don't know that, a lot of people say, oh, well, they called him Rutherford. And long story short, the election was contested between him and Samuel Tilden, and it came down to 2 states. I think it was South Carolina and Florida, believe it or not. And the electoral votes were disputed by those 2. Hayes had to win all of them to win the election. And it goes to the House of Representatives, and they basically make this deal where he promises to end Reconstruction and pull the troops out of the South if they will throw all those electoral votes to him, which they do. He pulls all the troops out of the South, but people forget the fact that public opinion was very much against Reconstruction at this point. And so it wasn't like Reconstruction was going great and Rutherford B. Hayes just pulled the plug from underneath them. It wasn't quite that simple.
James A. Garfield took
have
on
been one of our
corruption in the
greatest
Senate
presidents.
and civil service with some
But we'll never
success, but was shot by an embittered lawyer just 4 months into his first term and died of his wounds.
Killed by his doctor. All right, so a lot to talk about here. James Garfield, another Ohio guy. There's this long span from Grant all the way up through William Howard Taft. And then actually, if you go all the way up to Garfield, you've got a long span where almost every president is a Republican from Ohio. Garfield, smart guy, our only ordained minister as a president from here in Northeast Ohio where I live, from Menor, Ohio. He was the president of a university, I think, was it Hiram? I think it was Hiram. Could write with Latin in one hand and Greek in the other at the same time. Just brilliant guy. Civil War veteran as well. He had been a general. Probably would have been one of our greatest presidents. I have no doubt of that. But he gets shot a couple months into his term. And his Secretary of War was Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son. Incidentally, Robert Todd Lincoln was present for Garfield's assassination. He was in Buffalo when McKinley was assassinated. And, of course, he was in Washington when his father was assassinated. And after McKinley's assassination in 1901, Lincoln swore to never go near another president. Of course, he did in 1922 when they built the Lincoln Memorial. But anyway, all that said, Leon Czolgosz is the guy who shoots Garfield. He was kind of deranged and had done all this work, he thought, to help get Garfield elected, and would stalk Garfield hoping for some important patronage job. And when he didn't get it, he hunted him down and shot him in the back in a train station. But Garfield would have survived with an even somewhat competent doctor. The doctors basically killed him. They probed around for months. They made his wound worse. If they had done nothing, if they had just let him alone, his body would have healed around the wound, and he probably would have survived and been fine. But Czolgosz made that argument. He said, "I didn't kill him; the doctors did." But he was hanged for the crime, rightly so.
Chester Arthur, son of an Irish Baptist preacher. Against expectation, he proved above political faction and continued Garfield's work
Which
of
was interesting
reforming
because
government
he was
bureaucracy.
part of a huge political faction.
Grover Cleveland, the first Democrat president since the Civil War, and the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He used the presidential veto with gusto, blocking measures he thought were beyond the remit of federal government, even pensions for Civil War veterans and subsidies for destitute farmers.
Which was really interesting for him with the pensions for Civil War veterans, because he's the only guy between Grant all the way up through McKinley who had not been a Civil War veteran. And, of course, that was something that was a big criticism of him. He wins election in 1885, gets defeated by Benjamin Harrison, but then defeats Harrison, running for re-election 4 years later.
Look out for part 2 of U.S. Presidents.
All right, so I guess we're wrapping it up right there. Let me know your thoughts about all these presidents, about the things that I've said. Where would you rank some of these guys? Who do you think maybe is underrated or overrated as a president? And use that comment section below. Drop a like if you would, and be watching for part 2 coming tomorrow. Thanks for watching.